Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. As James said, my name is Adam Graber, and I'm a director here at FaithTech. And I'm joined tonight, I'm really excited to be joined by Paul Burns, Stacey Anberry, and Brett Robinson, who I will introduce in a moment. I just want to give you a sense of where we're headed this evening and what you can expect. We're going to talk together as a panel here, and then we're going to have an opportunity for some Q&A, and then you're going to have the opportunity to move into table groups. And so the conversation tonight is going to be a really valuable one, and I think it will inspire a lot of conversation for you as you have thought about these topics, are interested in these topics, and have questions of your own. So as we go in and start to talk about these things, I think it'll inspire a lot more conversation for you. You know, we have all these great panelists, but I want you to know that they don't have all the answers either. And the goal tonight here is not to give you answers, it's to help give you perspective. And I think these speakers are going to shed light on new aspects that maybe you haven't thought about before. And they're going to give us a sense of the larger picture of the many dimensions that politics, technology, and faith have. And it will, I hope, help you to think and refine your thinking around these different questions that we have. So, you know, all of us have blind spots, and we can really help each other. And that's really the opportunity, is we have this opportunity to be stronger because we're learning from each other, not because we're right about an issue, but because we've learned from each other, even and especially when we disagree with each other. So with that, let me introduce our panel. First off, I want to introduce Stacey Anberry, who is the president and founder of Be Stellar Group. And her group provides professional development workshops and consulting. She's an entrepreneur, and Stacey has worked in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Add to that a background in government relations, both in the US and Canada. Stacey, you've covered a lot of ground. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
Yeah. And next up is Brett Robinson. He is the Director of Communications and Catholic Media Studies at the McGrath Institute at the University of Notre Dame. And his research covers the intersection of religion, technology, and culture. And he's the author of Appletopia, Media Technology and the Religious Imagination of, get this, Steve Jobs. He's written for CNN, the LA Times, and Wired Magazine. And Brett's also on vacation this week, but he kindly agreed to join us this evening. So Brett, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. This is the best kind of vacation to be with you, so thank you.
Awesome. And I don't know if Paul is there yet. He was with us earlier. Let's see if he's joining us. There he is. Hi, Paul. Good to see you. So Paul is the managing director at Twitter in Canada. He leads the vision, innovation, and growth for Twitter in Canada. Prior to working at Twitter, he consulted on innovation for a lot of brands like Apple, Google, Nike, and as you would expect, you can find him on Twitter at Paul Burns. Paul, it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. So excited to be here.
Cool. So I want to just jump in. And Paul, I want to start with you. You know, in the past decade, social media has seen a lot of ups and downs. You know, I think back to 10 years ago, it was 2011, and social media was sort of being hailed for its role in what was then called the Arab Spring, sort of this wave of democratic protests across the Arab world. And even for things like Occupy Wall Street. And it was sort of overturning these established institutions, and people were hailing what social media was doing there. And now it's 10 years later and it's 2021, and social media isn't so much the darling that it was 10 years ago. And, you know, people are blaming it for its role in the Capitol Hill uprising in January. And last year, the social dilemma came out, and it was really took social media to task. You know, it kind of put the screws to social media, including Twitter, right? And I'm curious, what do you think has happened in the last 10 years that has really caused this shift to start happening?
Yeah. Well, just thanks for having me here. Just excited to be here. 10 years is a long time on the internet. It's like an eternity.
Really,
so, you know, what's changed in the last 10 years? A whole lot. As it relates to social media, I suppose the biggest thing that's changed was, you know, 10 years ago, a lot of social media sites were relatively new, you know, a couple years old. And, you know, now they are, you know, dare I say, essential sort of daily utilities that are part of our lives in many ways good and in many ways bad. And so I think they're just way more prevalent in our culture, in our life, and how we conduct ourselves, and how we engage in relationships. And so I think that's a massive change. I also think that today, in many ways, social media channels, they're the primary way many of us are, you know, actually getting news and information and entertainment content. You know, they are in many ways the first point of entry into an article or a video. And so I don't know that was as prevalent 10 years ago. So I think you've got just a very different sort of behavior. But the biggest thing for me, I would say, just to answer your question, is I feel like, you know, over the course of the last decade, I think people are finally starting to see the, you know, the side effects, the impacts, you know, and maybe the addictions that actually we didn't see 10 years ago that are associated with social media, with the, you know, the hit that you get, the dopamine hit that you get when you get 100 likes on a post. You know, these are things we didn't really contemplate 10 years ago. And so I think it's changed our psychology in many ways. It's changed, you know, how we, you know, value these tools. And I would just say that comes with just the maturity of it being so woven into the fabric of our culture. And so those would be a couple big changes. I would say for me, like, you know, thinking about some of the comments you made at the outset, you know, algorithms, the way these platforms recommend content.
Right.
You know, 10 years ago, recommendation engines were awesome new ways to discover new content. And I would say today, you know, one could argue that it's keeping people, it's reinforcing biases potentially. It's maybe not exposing people to different points of view. And so we're starting to see some of those downstream implications. But the biggest change I think I've seen, and I'm curious what others think on the panel, but for me, the biggest observation has been the change in how social media, people are deriving their identity from social media in many ways. Not everyone, but I definitely see this as a theme where, you know, people are coming to social media to almost get validated or to reaffirm who they are. You know, if you get, you know, 1,000 likes on a post, it makes you feel better about yourself. And so I think the way people have almost attached who they are to their online persona has dramatically changed. And you know, given that this is a faith-based event, I think, you know, God wants us to find that identity in Him, not in social media. So those would be a couple, I would say, high-level observations of what's changed over the last 10 years.
Yeah, that's great. There's this sense of it's become more central, it's become more primary, but also like it takes time for side effects to sort of work their way out, for us to sort of recognize those, and also for it to kind of be internalized and become part of who we are. I'm curious, Brett or Stacy, if you have some thoughts around what's happened in the last 10 years.
What I've found has happened for those who may use a platform, I used to be somebody who used it, people are more comfortable with allowing the world and people they don't know into their personal lives. So I found people are more comfortable sharing like really personal stories of, pregnancy, for example. Oh, my baby's here, look at my baby. And even now being more combative. So I found before, especially when I used to be an early person who was on it, it wasn't as combative as I found it has slowly become more combative. People are more comfortable being combative, or they're going to Twitter to be combative or to cancel or to drag somebody. So let me go on Twitter and let the world know, or this person know how I really feel. So I think that has added to some of the friction, because if you see one person being combative, it's like a domino effect. Either people are like, oh yeah, I could join this conversation in that direction. And of course, the algorithms seem to be, I'm not a techie expert, more rage inducing. Like it seems like because problems are more trendy than solutions, we're talking about a lot of problems that are real in society without having real conversations that are solution focused. And I found that people are more comfortable with that type of dialogue, just from my perspective.
So almost as people have become more comfortable, not only to share themselves online, they're more willing to maybe share controversial opinions as well. Brett, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I guess as the only non-Canadian on the panel, I'll quote Marshall McLuhan here so I can fit in, the Canadian media theorist. But he talked about electric technologies creating the conditions for a global village, and a lot of people took that to mean that it would be a peaceful, harmonious place when we could all connect in this way. I think what they missed in that phrase is that villages are actually very agonistic, conflict-oriented places. We've kind of re-entered a oral environment, if you will. So much like living in a village when you hear everything happening at once and you have to react, we're back in that mode when we spent a lot of time in 500 years really in a print mode of thinking, which was much more privatized, which was much more contemplative in our consumption of information. So the instantaneousness of reaction that's required in the new environment, as Paul alluded to, creates a new psychology in which conflict breeds more quickly. And so I think that realization has come to light and to surface as people assemble in their various tribes. And so this is a problem, and it's something, unfortunately, that marketers kind of created over the past 50 years on television, which is, which tribe do you belong to? Is it Coke or Pepsi? Is it Nike or Reebok? Is it Mac or PC? So on the one hand, you have this very democratizing potential of something like social media, but then it also draws out some of these more conflict-oriented, almost authoritarian dynamics when it comes to these alignments. So those are things we have to work through, that we are working through. So,
and so are you suggesting then that, and I've heard you each mention algorithms a little bit, maybe as a culprit. Are you suggesting that they're amplifying conflict that was sort of suppressed before, or was latent in society, or was it always there? What's your sense of that?
I'll just chime in on that. I sorry, Adam.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, from my perspective, I think one of the conversations we're constantly having inside Twitter is, what does the product incentivize, and what type of conversations, and what is being rewarded? Something simple like the like button or the retweet. What does that incentivize in people's behavior? And does it incentivize, does it incentivize graceful conversations? Or is outrage rewarded? And I think you could argue in many cases that outrage is, you've got a big, bold, condemning statement, as sort of Stacy alluded to. In many ways, those are the types of conversations that get amplified. the binary conversations, the ones that are absolute. It's either this or it's this. And so I think we're constantly asking ourselves, how does that actually, incentivize the right type of behavior online? One thing that gets totally destroyed in all of this, in any social media, not just I would say in all social media, is nuance. And we all know in conversations, if we were sitting at the dinner table together and you were to try and describe your opinion on a potentially controversial topic, it might be a very complicated opinion, and it might be a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but maybe some of this too. So social platforms in many ways don't necessarily allow for that.
Yeah.
And our world is steeped in nuance. And so maybe less about algorithms, more about how do we allow for nuance to actually be incorporated into how those conversations take place. That would be just a quick take on the algorithm question.
Yeah, and even with Zoom, it allows us for a little bit more nuance. It allows us to dive in a little bit deeper, but it takes 45 minutes or an hour to have that kind of conversation, and to you can't do that in a 1-minute tweet, right? So
it seems like.
Go ahead, Brett.
Well, I was just going to pick up on Paul's point about this kind of binary idea, and the web itself is the structure of the web, the grammar of the language, if you will, is binary. So in some ways, the form drives the content. Not in some ways. I mean, the medium is the message. So that formal characteristic of the web, which is a binary architecture, naturally lends itself to sort of binary behaviors. So I think the dinner table is a great example of sort of a focal practice or place where embodied presence overcomes some of those limitations. So the question is, how does the social media sphere become a complement to the very real conversations that are happening in embodied spaces? I really don't like when people say it's the new commons or the new public, because that suggests that it's a place, and it's really not. The places we inhabit are places, and our bodies need to be there for us to truly be present and to communicate well as human beings. So I think we need a new metaphor, if you will. I think in some ways the web is not so much a place as it is a kind of psychological extension of our own memory, imagination, and so forth. So to treat it as such, and to respect it as such, those are powers of the human soul. Those, the social dilemma suggests that we're just sort of these mental machines that can be manipulated through algorithms, but we are souls, embodied souls, and to attend to those powers and faculties of the soul, the virtues and the vices, I think is one of the modes of awareness that would really benefit the folks working in tech and the folks that are trying to become more literate in what it's doing in terms of the effects.
So it's an extension. It's not another place, but an extension of the place we already are in. And we need to sort of see it as supplementing our lives, not being a substitute or another place we go to that is somehow other, is kind of what you're saying. I want to, Stacy, kind of come to you and talk a little bit about content moderation. Almost all these social platforms have content moderation settings, but they've been challenged in various ways. And for example, Facebook allows politicians to sort of go around their community standards, because Facebook has said, it kind of considers political speech as newsworthy. And so they don't have to necessarily follow the community standards. They sort of are rising above it. But then, another place like in Germany, posting Nazi slogans or on social media or using a swastika is considered illegal, and you can be arrested for it, and people have. And I'm curious, do you think there's a sort of one size fits all approach to moderating content? Do you think it can be at a global level across all these different nations, or does it need to be at a national level, or does it need to be at a smaller level? And where would you draw those lines in your perspective?
I definitely don't think there's a one size fit all, because every country has its own values, its own traditions, its own norms. And we do have real legal and political systems that are not the same, even from Canada to the US. As close as we are, our political systems are so different. We don't even have term limits for our prime minister. And so to try to have this concept of this global community online, which is what I call a virtual reality, it's not really real life. It's a reflection of even some of the darker sides of the world that we don't like, and a reflection of some of the good things. It just amplifies that. And it's interesting that you said they give these exceptions to elected leaders in terms of the guidelines. Well, they do that in the real world. There's certain things that politicians can get away with that you and I can't get away with because of the power they already hold. And then they go into the sphere that's always designed to amplify their power. So if you have power, your power is going to just be bigger because you already have power. So it's hard to think or to try to have a one-size-fits-all approach because of all the things that actually divides us. And politics also divides us more so than, bringing us together. So it's a way, it's important for these companies to almost focus on what is their intention, right? Is it to keep people engaged by any means necessary? Because there's money behind this, like they got shareholders. So is it more valuable to do what's good for the bottom line or what's good for society? Like those are kind of the decisions that happen in boardrooms that, I have no idea what they talk about, but I think those are some of the conversations that we need to think about. Like we need to start focusing on value and impact as opposed to just the bottom line, because that leads to a whole lot of other challenges. And we could see that in several sectors, right? So.
Brett, Paul, do you have thoughts around these questions of content moderation? And, there's different ways to moderate content or to moderate people that are posting content. In the case of President Trump, it was a decision to ban him from Twitter and from Facebook versus downgrading his posts or downgrading the visibility of what he's posting. What are your thoughts around these questions?
I'll just chime in quickly, just building off of what Stacy said. Having had a bit of a front row seat to how those decisions are made. They're not simple decisions. And, I think a lot of people might externally feel like these decisions are made on a whim or they're quick. They're definitely not. They take time. They're very weighted and thoughtful and considered. And I would say that most of those, if not every single one of those conversations, are anchored in this idea of what's right. And, do we always make the right decisions? No. Do we have tons of room to grow as a company and as a platform? Like, absolutely. So I think, and we have people inside Twitter where both sides of the political aisle are represented. Having one of the benefits of being in Twitter is it's a very free space to sort of share your opinions. So we had a lot of employees who thought that some of those decisions we made with respect to the election and the inaugurations were not the right ones, and many employees thought it was the right thing to do. And so, but we do have these debates, very vibrantly, and Jack allows that. Jack allows for those types of conversations to take place. So I think the goal, one of our number one priorities as a company, is to have, and there's actually an objective with people assigned to it and resources and teams and people all over the world, is the health of the public conversation. And if you were to dissect our mission, it's to serve the public conversation. And how do we make that a healthy one? And I think you'll get varying degrees on what does it mean to be healthy. How do you actually define that? But I think what we faced in the last 2 years, in the last few years, it's unprecedented in terms of, the types of content that exists online. One school of thought is, well, Twitter should be this open, free, unbelievably, open place, zero content moderation. If you have an opinion, just go. So that's one side of the discussion. The other side of the discussion is, no, actually, Twitter, you have a responsibility and an accountability to make sure that we are actually doing some content moderation against things that may be actually factually incorrect. And I think you saw some of this as the sort of election cycle went through. we started off by labeling, President Trump's tweets, and that was a label. That basically the intent behind that was not to, and then everyone called it as, we're fact checking. I think the goal and the intention behind it was to suggest that there's other opinions on this claim. Do some research for yourself. So yeah, it is a tricky one, I think, and I don't know that we have got it completely right. I think we've got a lot of room to grow, and our policies. So the way some people may know this, but the way these things happen is you've got rules that get made, and then you've got the ability to enforce those rules. And the policies and the rules that get made, they're different policies today than there were 10 years ago, partly because we're dealing with different things, and we're in a different political climate, with COVID-19 and vaccine information. And so the way we structure those conversations are very considered, very thoughtful. And the way we enforce those policies are also very thoughtful and considered. And, just to anchor it into my personal point of view as a Christian inside this organization, it's we actually get together and pray for our leaders. Who may not be believers. We pray for them. We pray for wisdom and guidance. And I think I want them to be given godly wisdom as they make these big crazy decisions that are they have weight to them. And so, and I guess I empathize with the way those decisions are made. I see the process and the consideration that goes into those decisions. I don't envy having to make those decisions from our policy team or Jack. But I also, know that Jack is the first one to take criticism and actually listen to it and know that, maybe we need to reconsider some stuff. So internally, it's a very, very beautiful place to be able to, if you have a different opinion, to discuss it and talk through it. And so anyway, these are things that if you were to ask this question again in 9 months, there may be a totally different take on how we build rules and policies and how we enforce them than today. And partly, candidly, sorry, I'm taking up more time. Partly why these exist is because there are no rules. There are no governing rules that exist that govern the internet this way. And so you end up in a situation where a lot of these platforms and these companies are trying to do its best in the moment. And that's kind of the situation we're in.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, there's a lot of dialogue that happens within Twitter before a decision is made. But it all goes back to what Brett was talking about in the sense of like, there's a kitchen table where people are having a nuanced discussion, but it has to result in a fairly binary decision. Does the person stay on the platform? Is the person removed from the platform? Does the post stay on the platform, or is it flagged, or is it taken off? I'm curious, Brett, if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking back to the first question about what's changed in the last decade. And one of the things that's changed in 2018 was that newspaper readership fell behind for the first time. Social media readership is the main source of news. So I think we need to decide what public service or common good or community interest the social media platforms serve, so that they can be I guess, dealt with accordingly. Because if they are a replacement for the newspaper, that's a really important institution that serves the public interest and the common good. And we don't want to create kind of virtual communities. We want to have real communities, again, that can use these things as complements to their own substance. So you can see in small towns that lose local newspapers, their bond ratings actually go down because it's the newspaper that provides the forum for the discussions around matters of public interest in that local community. So when everybody sort of rushes to the sort of national conversation or the geopolitical conversation and begins to ignore local interests, and on top of that, do it on a platform that's actually geared towards advertising and entertainment and not towards pure journalism in the sort of objective sense, then you get a very odd mix of interests in play that can be a threat to the sort of the common good and the public interest. So we have to decide what they are first, because they don't fit neatly into any category that we have at the moment.
Yeah, it does kind of transcend multiple categories, from publisher to content creator to neutral platform, as it were. I want to shift a little bit and talk about biblical orientation. Brett, you've been writing and researching, and your focus has been around religion and technology and culture. If we look back, you kind of mentioned the 20th century and journalism, broadcast television, and newspapers. And society has sort of trusted journalists to track down news stories, verify facts, report them to the masses. But now it's the 21st century, and anyone can post a YouTube video and anyone can create a news site. And now those journalists are kind of being questioned for having their own agendas, or and what they're publishing and putting out there is overwhelmed by this flood of information. I'm curious, from a biblical perspective, like, are there stories or passages of scripture or biblical principles that sort of guide your thinking around these questions of truth, of who do I trust, of social media in the 21st century?
Yeah, I appreciate that you asked the Catholic for the scriptural references, since we don't know our Bibles as well, but I will do my best. One verse that came to mind was Ecclesiastes 1 verse 8, which is that there's nothing new under the sun, right? So I just said a moment ago that we need these new categories, but in a way, we're experiencing something that's been around for a long time, and that is this issue of truth and trust. What's interesting about that verse is it begins, the eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again, and what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. So that reminds me of this kind of, I guess, lust of the eyes that we have when we use these screens to acquire and consume all of this information and news. But the issue of trust and truth, I think, goes back to the garden, right? That the original lie, that we could be like gods, that we could access this knowledge, this omniscience, and be godlike. I joke with my students that kind of makes Adam and Eve the first Apple customers, because they took the bite, and Steve Jobs gleefully used it as the logo. But yeah, I mean, human communication, I think it requires vulnerability. And when we increase the number of layers that we have between us and other people, and there's so many right now, the potential for miscommunication, for manipulation increases, I think, exponentially. It's easy to comment anonymously on Twitter about something or insult somebody,
Right.
when I would never do that to their face. So the other one, of course, the other, I guess, scriptural verse or passage I would think of would be that, that the truth shall set you free, and that the word was made flesh. And that's something I always come back to is, how do we preserve these embodied modes of human communication, privilege them, because they are the root of community and communion. In the Catholic tradition, of course, the Eucharist is the body and blood of our Lord. And so that embodiedness, that sacramental presence in the world, I think that those are essential to trust and to truth. So that's perhaps a way of dodging the question a little bit. How do you build it online? I would say what Pope Francis said in his most recent World Communications Day address in January, which comes from the first chapter of John, come and see. So if you're making a claim, if you're engaging in social media, there should be an invitation to an encounter too, not just sort of dropping bombs or leaving things out there, but really inviting people into a true encounter. I think that might be an ethic worth pursuing.
Cool. Thanks for that. I want to give our audience a little bit of chance to speak in. We're running up against time. I knew we would have so much to talk about, and it's been a great conversation. I'd love to, I ran across this question. Someone asked, how can social platforms transition from facilitating a mob mentality to moving people towards discourse? And that a little bit picks up on, Brett, what you were saying, the sense of how do we draw people into encounter versus just kind of dropping these bombs on each other and using technology in a weaponized way. How can we cultivate that encounter?
Well, I think of one of the tenets of the Church's social teaching, subsidiarity, which is what can we do at the local level before we kind of defer to larger organizations or to a higher level. And I think there's all kinds of opportunities, missed opportunities, to use social media in some very localized ways. A friend of mine does these maker spaces where they share a server and they use social media connect over making these different handicrafts and things. And so they're using shared technology to do something local, material, physical, and embodied that connects them as a community in a very real way. I can imagine parishes or congregations, I'm sure many already do this, using social media platforms to connect people locally, to share resources, to pray for one another, to use them in that way. I think the mob mentality, I think, comes from, again, this sort of almost like television mentality of, you know, buy the world a Coke, teach the world to sing, you know, dream it, you can be it, this sort of fantasy land of one world, one love. We've got to move beyond that. Digital is not about fantasy, it's about memory. Computers are memory devices, they remember. And that could be a boon for religious people and people of faith, because religion is a chain of memory. So to the extent that we can use this as a tool to remind ourselves of where we come from and who we are, and what our tradition teaches and so on, these are powerful ways of using the platforms and the connectivity to create real conversation that's life-giving, and that isn't just pure, again, antagonism or entertainment for entertainment's sake, right? Advertisers love high arousal stuff because it means more attention and more engagement. But Christ was meek, he was gentle, he was not bombastic, he was not looking to stir up, you know, big fights, although some occurred. But that meekness and gentleness, putting on Christ first before entering, you know, the digital sphere, I think could transform it.
And can I just quickly add to that?
Yeah, please do.
So the scripture also teaches us to be the head and not the tail. So to avoid the mob mentality, well, don't follow the mob. Have that courage, which we're supposed to have, to go against the grain and to, you know, almost add water to fire and come with that peace and that joy and try to see the brighter side of a conversation. And then that might cause the other people who are joining the mob to think differently, because I think we're not inspiring critical thinking enough as well. And so if we come with that approach, that could help to deal with the mob mentality that seems to be growing rather than shrinking.
Thanks, Stacey. Paul, I want to give you the last word here.
It's funny just being at Twitter and watching a lot of the conversations. And if I'm being super honest, you know, Christians sometimes can be the worst offenders on social media. You know, we're very, and I say that like just very honestly, that, you know, it's quick with an opinion, slow to listen sometimes, you know, and I just think we're called to be like Jesus in every single situation. And, you know, far too often that sort of beautiful, loving image of Jesus that we're supposed to look like, it almost becomes impossible to see sometimes because it's hidden by our big opinions online. And I do think for us as believers, you know, when things happen, either a political decision or, you know, a law that gets passed or someone says something that aggravates you, you know, when you squeeze an orange juice comes out. When you squeeze an apple juice comes out. When you squeeze a Christian, you know, far too often we don't see Christ come out in that moment. And that should feel really weird for us, I think. And so I think all these conversations always make me think about, how am I showing up in conversations online? How am I listening more? How am I becoming love in those situations? How am I adding grace? You know, when someone's wrong online, we are quick to, point that out. So I think the same principles, biblical principles, if we could find a way to apply that online, it starts with each of us, if each of us did that, we could change the world. So I think it's a little bit of just making sure that we're hyper cognizant of the bandwagon we're jumping on. Are we part of the solution or part of the problem?
Yeah. And as Brett said, moving us towards this sense of encounter. If we're encountering Christians online, that has the opportunity for them to be encountering Jesus online as well. Paul, Stacy, Brett, thank you so much for joining us.